December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning on the Hawaiian Islands. The sun had just risen. Civilians were still asleep. Sailors were sipping their morning coffee. Some were writing letters home. Others were simply dreaming, unaware of what was coming. The skies were clear, the waters still. But far above, the Pacific wings of war were already approaching. In under 2 hours, more than 2,400 lives would be lost. Warships would burn, the sea would turn black with smoke and oil. An entire fleet would be crippled, and history would turn a corner from which there was no return. This wasn't just an attack, it was the boldest military strike of the 20th century. A blow struck without warning, without a declaration, and it dragged the United States into the deadliest conflict in human history. Today, we go back to that moment, to the quiet before the fire, to the sky before it shattered, to the harbor that changed the world. To understand why Pearl Harbor became the target of one of the boldest attacks in modern history, we must travel back to the decade before the first bomb ever fell. The 1930s, across the Pacific, an empire was rising. Japan. From an isolated island nation, Japan had rapidly transformed into an industrial and military powerhouse. But power breeds hunger, and Japan wanted more. More land, more resources, more dominance in Asia. They invaded Manchuria, then China. Cities like Nanking fell under brutal occupation. But Japan's ambition didn't stop there. Their eyes turned south to Southeast Asia, rich in oil, rubber, and minerals. But there was a problem. These lands were under the control of Western colonial powers, Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States. The United States, watching from across the ocean, grew uneasy. When Japan moved into French Indochina, Roosevelt struck back. The U.S. froze Japanese assets. Most importantly, it cut off Japan's oil supply. It was a devastating blow. Japan imported over 80% of its oil. Without it, their tanks would stall, their ships would rust, and their planes would be grounded. To Japan's military leadership, this was not just economic pressure, it was a noose tightening around their throat. In the middle of this tension stood a man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He wasn't a warmonger. He had studied at Harvard, gambled in Las Vegas, and traveled across America. He understood the American spirit and the power of its industry. He won. If we go to war with the United States, we must strike first, and we must strike hard, for if the war drags on, we will lose. So Yamamoto devised a plan as daring as it was ruthless. Strike at Pearl Harbor, the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, before the Americans even knew they were at war. The plan was approved. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 planes, and a fleet of warships quietly slipped out into the Pacific. No radio signals, no chatter, just silence and a deadly course set toward Hawaii. Back in Pearl Harbor, it was just another peaceful weekend. No one suspected that 230 miles to the north, death was already in the sky. It was the largest carrier strike force the world had ever seen, and it vanished into the Pacific without a trace. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, over 400 warplanes, all sailing under a veil of radio silence. No messages in or out, no civilian sightings, only the sea, the sky, and a deadly purpose. December 2nd, 1941. The message was sent in secret using code, climb Mount Nitakayama, to the Japanese fleet. That meant only one thing. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a go. Now all that remained was to get into position 230 miles north of Oahu and wait for dawn. Meanwhile, on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, the world felt untouched by war. It was a quiet Saturday night. Sailors danced at bars in Honolulu. Some wrote letters home. Others played cards or dozed off in their bunks aboard the massive battleships lined up neatly in the harbor. Nobody expected anything. Nobody questioned the silence from Japan. At that same moment, far beyond the horizon, Japanese pilots checked their instruments. Engines were fueled, torpedoes were armed, fighter wings glinted under moonlight. They were young, many in their early 20s. Some carried good luck sashes from mothers. Others had written farewell poems in case they did not return. But they weren't kamikaze. Not yet. This was not a suicide mission. It was a calculated strike. A strike meant to cripple the U.S. Navy in one blow. Their target was clear. Battleship Row, where the pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay sleeping. USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS California, USS West Virginia, and nearby airfields, oil tanks, communication centers, only XPOSED. At 6 a.m., the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft lifted off the carriers. Fighter planes, dive bombers, torpedo bombers. They flew low over the ocean, waves masked by clouds, unnoticed by American radar operators still unfamiliar with what a real attack would look like. They would reach Oahu just after 7:45 a.m. And when they did, the world would never be the same. The time was now 7:48 a.m. The first bomb fell Sunday, December 7th, 1941, just before 8 a.m. At Ford Island Naval Air Station. Sailors were raising the flag. In mess halls, breakfast was being served. On the decks of battleships, crews were scrubbing the floors, laughing, sipping coffee. The air was calm, the water shimmered. But in the skies above Oahu, death was already falling. 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese dive bomber broke through the clouds, bright red sun on its wings. And then the bombs dropped. USS Arizona, a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb struck its forward magazine. In an instant, the ship exploded, torn in half. 1,177 men were killed, many instantly, trapped below decks, some burned alive, others never found. USS Oklahoma capsized, rolled completely over, trapping for 100 men inside. USS California and USS West Virginia were struck by torpedoes. Planes were destroyed on runways before they could take off. Fuel tanks burned, hangars collapsed. Men ran barefoot across flaming decks, and still the planes kept coming. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. Enemy planes overhead. The first wave lasted just 50 minutes. Then came silence, but it was a trap. At 8:40 a.m. the second wave arrived. 170 more aircraft, more bombs, more torpedoes, more death. The harbor became a hellscape of twisted steel, rising smoke and burning oil slicks that turned the water into flame. By 10 a.m., it was over. 2,403 Americans were dead, 1,178 wounded, 21 ships damaged or destroyed. More than 300 aircraft lost, the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Amid the wreckage, acts of heroism stood out. Men like Dory Miller, a black hook who'd never been trained on weapons, manned an anti-aircraft gun and fired back until he ran out of ammo. It was over. Nurses worked without rest. Sailors dove into flames to save others. Some never came back up. The harbor burned through the afternoon. Smoke rose for miles. And as night fell over Hawaii, the United States was already preparing for war. The next day, America declared war on Japan. And 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The world was now fully at war, and Pearl Harbor was the spark. The morning after the attack, the United States was no longer a neutral nation. It was wounded, angry, awake. Across the country, news spread like wildfire. Families huddled around radios. Newspapers ran bold headlines. And in Washington, D.C., the nation's leaders moved swiftly. On December 8th, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress and demanded war. The vote passed with near unanimous support, 82-0 inches the Senate, and just one dissenting vote in the House. The United States was officially at war with Japan, and within days Germany and Italy declared war on America. Just like that, the world was plunged fully into global conflict. The sleeping giant had been awakened. American factories converted overnight. Typewriters became rifles. Car plants produced tanks. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Young men volunteered by the millions. From New York to California, from Texas to Michigan, sons, brothers, and fathers lined up to enlist. Pearl Harbor hadn't destroyed America's resolve, it had ignited it. The attack had caught the U.S. off guard, but the response would be swift and unstoppable. Within a year, American forces were fighting on two fronts, against Imperial Japan across the Pacific, and against Hitler's war machine in Europe. From the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the South Pacific, Pearl Harbor echoed in every battle cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor." But even as the nation prepared for war, grief blanketed thousands of American homes. The dead of Pearl Harbor were honored in silence, their names etched into history. Some were buried in cemeteries. Others lay beneath the sea in the sunken hulls of battleships like the USS Arizona, which still rests in the harbor to this day, a tomb for over 1,000 men who never came home. Out of tragedy came unity, and from devastation determination. The United States would not just fight, it would lead. Pearl Harbor was not the end. It was the beginning of a war that would reshape the world. More than 80 years have passed since the morning Pearl Harbor burned. The world has changed. Nations have risen and fallen. Allies have become friends, even former enemies. But the echo of that day still carries across time. Every year on December 7th, survivors and families gather at Pearl Harbor. Some still remember the faces of those they lost. Others come to honor men and women they never met, but whose sacrifice gave shape to the world we live in today. The wreck of the USS Arizona still leaks out to this day. They call it the Black Tears. Drops of fuel rising to the surface, reminders of the souls entombed below. It's not just a war story. It's a human story of young lives lost, of choices made in smoky war rooms, of heroes who never got to grow old. Some survivors lived with the memory their entire lives. The sounds of bombs, the smell of smoke, the guilt of survival. And yet, from their pain came resilience. They built new lives, they rebuilt a nation, and they passed down their stories. So we would never forget. Pearl Harbor was a moment, but its impact shaped generations. It taught us the cost of complacency, the price of peace, and the power of unity in the face of darkness. Today, the U.S. and Japan stand not as enemies, but as partners, and the harbor, once filled with fire, is now a place of silence, of reflection, and peace. The attack on Pearl Harbor lasted just under 2 hours, but its story lives forever, lest we forget.